Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this year's Pollution Forum. Well, if you've been watching the news, I think you'll know exactly why we're here. Pollution is a major subject in the industry. From the instrumentation front, I think, I'm going to be brutally honest, I'm worried. The programs that the industry faces over the next 10 years is the size that we've unparalleled. We've just not seen it before. I was thinking about this last night, and we're almost approaching a perfect storm in slow motion. We've got pollution, we've got monitoring going in, we've got a skills shortage. The only hope I had, we saw the instrumentation apprentices yesterday, 6 teams of our future. They're the people who are going to leading the skills that are going to enable us to deliver these programs in the future. There's no question about us not monitoring. We've got to make sure that we do monitor to protect the environment. We all know the adage, we've got to monitor to manage. But wow, is there some monitoring coming. This morning, in the first 3 presentations, we're going to have a discussion of why. Why do we need to monitor? In the next sessions after that, we've got technical experts saying, how can we monitor? How can we get the best value of a multi-billion-pound program of monitoring that this country has never seen before? How can we deliver that? How can we do best for the public? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. Philip Dunne MP has championed river water quality. He's taken it to Parliament with courage. He's opened this issue that we can discuss, something that we've wanted to discuss for years. So, Philip.
Thank you very much, Oliver. When I went into politics 17 and a half years ago, I was elected as Member of Parliament for Ludlow, and those of you who are coming to Telford for the first time may not be aware that Ludlow is the southern third of Shropshire. It's the name of the constituency which covers the southern third of Shropshire, and it's essentially south of the River Severn from here. It's about 5 miles away. I didn't expect that my proudest achievement as a politician would be to have changed legislation in one direct effect. And that is really what I can put my name to, which is the amendments to the Environment Act, which came into law last November, which will require water companies to install monitoring equipment upstream and downstream of every outfall from every asset, whether a treatment plant or a storm overflow. Not something that you expect when you set out down a political journey to be the crowning achievement of your career. But the reason why I'm so pleased to have been invited by Oliver to join you here today and to look at the conference, because this is what you live and breathe every day of your working life. And I'm merely a Johnny-come-lately who's picked up on the issue of data management in order to transform the natural environment in which we all rely upon so much. So I think this is the most important thing in politics today. I'm sure that's quite a reasonably popular view amongst this fairly defined audience. It may not be such a widespread view. But the reason I think it's so important is because I've also become chairman of the Environmental Audit Committee, and on that committee, which is a select committee of Parliament, we spend our time scrutinising government policy on the environment and delivery against that policy. And we are very unusual as a parliamentary committee because we don't just shadow one government department. We can look widely across all aspects of government activity that touches on the environment. And frankly, we can stray beyond the British government. We can look at local authorities. We can even, to a degree, look at the devolved administrations. They don't really like us getting involved in questioning what they're doing, because that's the nature of the devolution settlement that we have. But we can also touch on the activities of all public sector bodies and the private sector. And we've not hesitated in calling to account the impact on the environment of many of the polluters in your space and the space that we're here to talk about today, in particular the water companies and increasingly the farming community. And it was clear to me when I started looking at this about nearly 3 years ago now, that this was a very, very complex problem. I came into it by being a member of, I think they claim to be the oldest established fishing club in the country. I think there are a number of clubs who make that claim, but the Lentwardine Fishing Club has a stretch of water just on the edge of my constituency, on the Herefordshire-Welsh border, and the chairman of that club has been chairman of the Severn Rivers Trust, and has now become chairman of the National Rivers Trust, called Jonathan White. I can't see him here, but he should be, because he got me interested in this by pointing out the impact of sewage pollution in particular, and the fact that very little was being done, or seemed to be being done, about getting to grips with the problem. And his suggestion was that we should adopt as a country more nature-based solutions to dealing with the effluent that we produce as human beings. And as there become more and more of us on the planet, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem everywhere, not just in the UK. And integrated constructed wetlands was his suggestion that we should be doing more of. And as it happened, about a month after him telling me about these things, which I'd never heard of before, I went on holiday just in Southern Ireland, and we stayed in my wife's very keen on riding. We stayed in a sort of school to teach people how to ride, and they had a very large stable, had about 100 horses, and a large hotel with a lot of people in it, and they therefore produced a lot of waste. And they'd set up, because it was Southern Ireland, they could access EU grants, they'd set up an integrated constructed wetland between the stables and a river which came past about 100 yards away. And this set of pools and reed beds were cleaning the effluent so that from the humans and the horses, so that it could go into the river without mechanical or chemical treatment. And it was a bit of an eye-opening moment for me about how we can actually do these things better and more cheaply, both to construct and to run, than the traditional means of dealing with human sewage. So that's what sort of got me into this subject. I then launched a private members bill. I became chairman of the Environmental Audit Committee, which allowed me to encourage the committee to not exactly direct its programme, but to strongly influence the work that we do. And that led us to do what is now, I think, widely recognised as a fairly seminal piece of work, the Water Quality of Rivers report, which was published a year or so ago. And we had the happy chance of being able to feed into the Environment Bill as it was progressing through Parliament. So many of our recommendations in our committee ended up in law in the Environment Act, because I was able to persuade the government that we needed to make changes in law in order to have real effect. And that's where the whole issue of data and monitoring and establishing what was really going on in our rivers has flown from that. Now, I don't need to tell any of you here about the importance of data, but we do have to tell politicians and remind them that evidence-based policy making tends to be more effective than dogma. And that's why the measurement of the state of our rivers and what is being put into our rivers by the activities of anybody who's at risk of polluting it is so utterly critical. And I'm sorry, this was something I come from a city background. I'm used to analysing data before making decisions, and this was absolutely clearly the right way to go. And it was also very clear that because of various pressures of development over the last 60 years, people politically, I'm afraid, anything to do with formal state-owned activities, so water companies, which were obviously state-provided public utilities, it gets seen through the prism of privatisation. Are you for or against it? Personally, I think this is irrelevant. There are various influences that it has, but the issue of river pollution and pollution across not just our rivers, obviously the rivers flow into the oceans, and to get to the rivers it has to go through the land. So the consequences of the environmental damage that we as humans do affects the entire environment. We have, for the last 60 years, since Bazalgette started introducing the concept of public sewers with he built for 100-year forecast. I think actually what he did was he projected what the population, understood what the population was, going back to data. He doubled it on the basis of natural growth, and then he doubled it again because he didn't think that we'd be very good at restraining our productive selves, and he was quite right to do that. And that lasted for about 100 years before the sewage systems in the cities that he brought it to began to get to capacity. And I would go back to the early 60s and would say that the development that has happened since the 60s and 70s above ground has not been reflected by the investment and development that we need to do underground in order to cope with the effluent that we as human beings are producing. And that's the fundamental problem. And we've taken all sorts of shortcuts over the decades intervening to try and manage this growing flow of problems. And that's led to combined sewer systems, storm overflows as the release valve. And so when I was discussing this with George Eustice, who was then the Secretary of State, he came to the realization, advised, I think, on this by the Environment Agency primarily, and his interactions with the water companies, that the only way we're really going to solve the problems of human sewage pollution is to separate the drainage systems completely. And he appeared before my select committee and he acknowledged that that was the ultimate solution, but that is a solution which will take decades and hundreds of billions of pounds to resolve. And therefore it's not credible to argue for banning sewage discharges into our waterways, because the consequence of doing that, if we were to ban them, as many politicians are calling for, would be that the sewage has to go somewhere else, and we don't have the capacity to take it within our structures. And if we were to build structures mechanically out of concrete, that would consume most of the construction capacity in the country in one go to do one thing, and it would be very unsightly and people wouldn't accept it. So it is not a credible solution. The solution has to come from doing it better, and I think there is a big role for nature-based solutions here and things like integrated constructive wetlands. But the starting point has to be to understand the scale of the problem and to prioritize the response to those places that are worse. And I think the sewage the storm overflow reduction plan that the government announced only a month or so ago now does recognise the importance of prioritisation, trying to deal with the worst problems first. It's come under quite a lot of flack. I think much of it is pretty ill-informed. I mean, there will be obviously things that people would like to have seen that are not in it. But I think it's the first serious attempt by any government since Bazalgette to try and get on top of this problem. And what they've announced is that Ofwat will be empowered to allow the water companies to invest, to essentially double their capital investment on water treatment for each of the next 25 years. So it's a £56 billion capital investment programme into the water sector, focused on solving the sewage problems. And my own view about this is that that's about right for a long-term plan, but that within that plan it should be possible for individual water companies to accelerate if they have the capacity to do so, and that they should be using their excellent innovation, which was already in the Environment Bill when our committee started looking at it, for water companies at last to produce a 5-year drainage plan by statute, a requirement to do this. Obviously they've had their own plans, but they haven't had to have them sort of, as far as I understand, I may be wrong, but I don't think they've been required by law to have them vetted by the Environment Agency and Ofwat before now. But so they will have these 5-year rolling plans. They will be encouraged by this by the reduction plan to prioritise getting rid of all the most serious incidents of pollution more quickly. If they want to do it more rapidly than the government plan, I think that should be something that they should negotiate with Ofwat. Some companies are better placed because of their capital structure and their performance to be able to move more quickly than others, and I think that if that's the case, they should get the credit for that and be allowed to do so. We saw last year, in response to the pandemic, the government recognising that there is a real place for improving our treatment infrastructure outside the conventional 5-year pricing periods. So the Green Recovery Fund, which was put in place by the previous Chancellor Rishi Sunak, had a big component of that, as you'll know, for water treatment investment. And something like 2/3 of it might not have been quite that, but over half of the capital investment which was consented under that plan went, I think it was over half, again, you'll know this better than me, but it went to Severn Trent because they had a lot of plans in the pipeline, in the hopper, ready to go, including the £300 million, the largest element, replacement of the main drains through Mansfield. Now, that was, I don't know the situation in Mansfield, but it was clearly one where they had decided it needed the same kind of impact as the Tideway Tunnel has had in London, which is obviously the sort of flagship project for replacing the main sewers for a whole city. But if Severn Trent can do it, can make a plan to do it for Mansfield, I think other water companies will be able to come up with significant schemes to transform sewage capture and storage and treatment in the right places in order to resolve these problems in our biggest polluting cities. So I think it's a really impressive and important and vital step. And as part of that, the work that you're all doing on measuring the water quality is absolutely fundamental. And I will just conclude, Oliver, by really applauding the work that everybody involved here does in trying to get a grip on this challenge. Measuring water quality, and I've seen from some of the people exhibiting here today, I've visited some sites. I've even had a piece of equipment loaned to me by one of your speakers later this afternoon, later this morning, to test water in my own constituency. And I'm pleased to say that Severn Trent have chosen, for some bizarre reason, that the River Team, which flows through the Ludlow constituency, should be one of the river stretches that they should try and go for bathing water quality status. I'm sure that's entirely coincidental, but I'm very pleased about it nonetheless. But that's because we have been monitoring through citizen science in the Clun catchment and through the work that we did with Rob Stevens, who I see at the back, to monitor the quality of the water there, both in chemical and biological terms. has encouraged Severn Trent to open its eyes to see what is going on there. I do think there is an issue over getting modern sensors adopted by water companies and getting access. And I was just talking to Andrew, who I see is here from the EA, about the certification of instrumentation. Technology has moved so quickly over the last few years. It is so much easier to monitor and measure what is happening in our rivers and to provide through telemetry that information in near real time. And that we need to have an accelerated means of getting this innovation and new equipment into use. And without that, it will stifle the innovation, people like you, to come up with these new gizmos and get them used for public benefit. So I think there's a sort of processing system that we need to speed up and ideally make as inexpensive as possible to get as much equipment into the waters as possible. I said that was the last thing. I'm going to say one other thing about this, about measurement. So the key thing that I introduced into the bill was the concept of making information more readily available. The spotlight of transparency leads to behavioural change. And the behavioural change that we're trying to address here is the pressure on the water companies to do something about the problem. I've tried to introduce some political pressure over the last 2 years, which has had some impact. Some of the water companies won't thank me for that, but I think they are at the most senior levels now completely cognizant of the fact that they need to change their priorities to invest as much in the treatment side of their business as they do in the supply side. The regulators are apprised of that. We've got new chairman and chief executive now at Ofwat. We've got a new chairman at the Environment Agency. We're about to get a new chief executive. They are appraised of that. The Office of Environmental Protection has come into being consequent from leaving the EU. The chairman and the chief executive of the OEP have chosen water quality as their first overarching issue to investigate. This is not going to go away as an issue. Oliver is quite right. It is right up there up the agenda, and providing information on what's happening in our rivers in near real time will enable the water companies to respond when there's been an incident in a much more timely fashion. It will enable the regulators to know what's going wrong so that they can get on the back of the water companies in a much, much more timely fashion. And most important of all, it will be available to the public. So if the public want to use the waterways for whatever type of recreation they get involved in, they will know whether it's safe to do so. And that will provide another source of public pressure to ensure on the water companies to ensure that they resolve these issues in a timely way, and we don't end up with as many damaging incidents that we currently see all too often on our screens now of dead fish in the river. I think this all comes back to the work that you do in providing means to measure and get that data out there to the public, and I applaud you all for the work that you do. Could not be more important. Thank you very much.
I think it's fair to say Pandora's box has been opened. We've got a hell of a challenge in the next 10 years, and it's going to take a lot of work to do it. Our next speaker, bit of change to the programme. I think we've almost got a better speaker than we had on the programme. Is Phil Hulme from the Environment Agency. He's going to talk to us, give us more context of where we are and where we need to be. Phil.
Yeah, so thank you Oliver, and thank you Philip. I'm from just across the border in Staffordshire, not Shropshire, but I was in Shropshire about a month ago to do a swim in Ellesmere, and I'm really pleased to tell you, Philip, that the water in Ellesmere tastes good. So I did my own little bit of monitoring. So I work for the Environment Agency. I work in Helen Wakem's team, who was supposed to talk today, but she couldn't make it. So I put my hand up. I lead on our storm overflow and drainage wastewater management planning strategy within the agency. I'm going to talk about some of the successes to date and some of the challenges around monitoring. I'm not going to go into the technical detail of monitoring because there's lots of people here that know an awful lot more than me about monitors. So just to work the button. So just to give some facts, there's around 15,000 storm overflows. 89% of them discharge to rivers, 10% to coastal and estuarine waters, and 1% to groundwater. From our data, the event duration monitoring data that Philip talked about, we found in 2021 that the average overflow spilled 29 times in that year, and the average duration was 7 hours. Each discharge was an average 7 hours. Quite remarkable. And I think that's the power that this data gives us to understand these high-level statistics. I just wanted to say something about storm overflows and the challenge that we've got. We're dealing with a very complex system. Even with this most simplistic model that I put here, we've got a storm overflow here, and the storm overflow primarily is to reduce the risk of sewer flooding. And it does that by, when we get heavy rainfall, discharging to the environment. And sometimes that rainfall isn't as heavy as what we expect it to be. To solve that problem, to solve the impact on the environment, simplistically, we've got two choices: more flooding or invest. And no one wants more sewer flooding. That's the wrong thing to do. So what Philip's been talking about is the investment programme and how the data is leading to that investment programme. But obviously that will impact on people's bills and it will cause disruption for communities. Most of our urban areas have combined sewage systems. As Philip said, if we wanted to make all them separate systems, we'd have to dig up most streets in our urban areas. That's going to take some time. Hence, we've got a programme and a trajectory for delivery. So, monitoring of storm overflows isn't new. I just want to talk about some of the history. So people that are old enough to be involved in this, in the 1970s and 80s, we designed sewage systems based on terminology called Formula A, or the Scottish Development Department. These standards were based on empirical relationships, and what the people of these committees that wrote these reports thought would be the right balance between spills and the environment, and came up with some empirical standards. And there was little monitoring at that time. From privatisation, we've seen monitoring, but in a very reactive way. So we've used surveys. There's some people that are familiar to the industry will know FRO 466 surveys, Foundation for Water Research report, to do surveys of sewage litter, sewage fungus downstream of overflows. Reactively, once you identify there's a risk, you would go and do a survey, and that would prove that there is a cause and effect relationship of the environmental impact and the storm overflow. And similarly, in the 90s, something called urban pollution management techniques, which relied on, again, reactive monitoring to assess the impact on dissolved oxygen and ammonia of storm overflows. And then that work drove significant investment in storm overflows. So between 2000 and 2015, about 8,000 of the 15,000 storm overflows have been improved. But that monitoring and that programme was based on finding something that's broken already in the environment, working out what's causing it, and then fixing it. Where we've been in the last decade is event duration monitoring came in, monitoring the frequency of storm overflows. And we've seen that ramp up significantly to about 85% of storm overflows are now monitored, and by 2023, December 2023, all storm overflows will have this event duration monitoring on them. And we've used that data proactively. The storm overflows that spill most frequently have been investigated through the water company's water industry national environment programme, something called the Storm Overflow Assessment Framework, which has identified where there's an impact on the environment. And where there's been an impact on the environment, decisions have been made whether improvements are necessary. And one of the tests for that is whether it's cost beneficial. There's been a test in between what's the cost of the improvements against the benefits that you'll achieve by these improvements. What we've found is that hasn't driven as many improvements as what we would have liked. So that's where we are today. Just want to quickly say that the Environment Agency has been collecting this event duration monitoring data from the water companies, putting it in a standard format, and in the last couple of years we've been publishing it. There's now a statutory requirement through the Environment Act for us to publish that, and that data is available on our website. So I just want to talk about some of the data that we've seen. So I talked about 85% coverage of storm overflows having this event duration monitoring data on. This measures the number of spills and the duration of spills. And this is where we are by company. Most companies are almost there, but in 2021 there was one big gap, and that was Angling Water. Angling Water have got a way to go. They've got to really accelerate their EDM programme to make 100% coverage by December 2023. The graph on the right hand side shows the number of spills and the average duration of spills by companies, and the three blue bars which are the highest are South West Water, United Utilities and Yorkshire. Not surprisingly, they're parts of the country that receive most rainfall. So the investment programme probably isn't going to be evenly spread across the country. Move on to the next slide. So this graph on the left shows how often these overflows spill, and I've linked it to, so what we can see is that 13% of overflows in 2021 didn't spill. 60% of overflows spilt more than 10 times, and that's a really important statistic, because within the Environment Act it talks about 10 rainfall events, and we're interpreting that as 10 spills per year in our WIPAC programme for investment of the water companies. So 60% of storm overflows will need investment based on the 2021 data, if that's typical, and it is pretty typical 2021 in terms of rainfall, to meet that standard. That's a lot of the overflows. 16% more than 60 times, and 5% more than 100 times in the year. That's on average twice a week. That's far too many times. In 2021, we asked the companies for the first time to give us an indication of why these overflows are spilling so often. And this is the chart on the right hand side. So the black part of the bar is where water companies didn't tell us, but the other colours, basically, I won't go into the detail, but basically a significant proportion of spills occur due to operational issues. So they're not just due to rainfall events, they're due to failure within the sewerage system. And that's something that the Environment Agency has to tackle with the water companies. Not just the capacity of the pipes, it's making sure that these pipes continue to operate as they should. And there's some diversity in the numbers that the water companies are giving us, but probably need to treat that data with a bit of caution, because it's the first time they gave it to us last year. And then we've been looking at the completeness of data from water companies, and we're on average, we're getting about, so the statistic is, if we say that ideally we'd like these monitors to work 100% of the time, so if there's a spill, they can record it any time. What we're finding is that they don't work all the while. There's issues with data monitoring, with spikes in the data. Some people have suggested spiders crawling over sensor heads, but there's a lot of spiders around if that's the case. And what we've found from 2021 is 87% of storm overflows were providing data for more than 90% of the time. But that's a big gap. 13% of overflows weren't providing that data. That's something that the water industry needs to improve on. So I just want to move on to, with my sticky clicker, want to move on to a slide here just to explain what we're doing with this data in the Environment Agency. And we're doing lots of different things, from hard regulation, using this data to inform and improve our permitting, monitoring, compliance and enforcement approach, the hard regulatory approach that we have. But we're also using this data, as Philip says, to inform the Water Industry National Environment Programme, to develop a programme of improvements for water companies to deliver, not just in the next 5 years, but up until the late 40s, 2040s, with significant investment from 2025 to 2030. We've been using this data, as has been explained in the previous talk, to develop strategic tools, to inform, to provide that evidence for the Environment Bill and the Environment Act, to provide that evidence for Philip's discussions at the Environment Audit Committee, and to inform what those targets should be within the Storm Overflow Reduction Plan. We're also using that data now to communicate performance of the water companies. Going back probably 20 years, out of sight and out of mind was I think a phrase that could be used about the sewage side of the wastewater industry. Now that data is available, we need to use it, and it gives water companies a real opportunity to show corporate social responsibility, to show their funders that they are doing the right thing. And Philip touched on this as well. Water companies' drainage and wastewater management plans. This data is integral to show the performance, the current performance, and the trajectory of what that performance might end up like due to climate change, urban creep, i.e. people paving over gardens, and population growth. And drainage wastewater management plans, which will be statutory through the Environment Act as drainage and sewage management plans, are that tool. And eventuation monitoring data is key to inform those. So I've been worrying that all the pain that I and my team and various other people involved in storm overflows is going through is unusual, but we've seen all this media attention, and sometimes it's not very nice being on the wrong end of this media attention. This chart here is from an academic book on corporate social responsibility, and it shows how public awareness of issues can increase and how that can then develop into further media coverage, leading political figureheads, developing discussions, developing new legislation, and new legislation being developed. And that is exactly what's happened for storm overflows over the last 5 years. And eventuation monitoring has fueled some of that, but I think it's going to happen anyway. What eventuation monitoring data has given is it's given that evidence base to inform that discussion about what that new legislation might look like. So I just want to recap on some of the successes around eventuation monitoring, and just reinforce that monitoring of storm overflows isn't new. Proactive monitoring of storm overflows is new. We used to do it reactively when we knew there's a problem. So eventuation monitoring has enabled us to move from a find and fix of the unsatisfactory environmental outcomes to a position now where we're understanding asset performance. It's also become a key metric to communicate storm overflow performance to stakeholders and customers, informing the prioritisation of improvement programmes in the current AMP, informed by PR19, the political debate, the Environment Act, the Storm Overflow Reduction Plan that DEFRA published in late August, and evolving WINET programmes. And it's also started to inform the Environment Agency's regulatory work, including our work on major investigations where we think something's gone wrong with water company performance. Got a few slides here, and a few minutes left, so that's okay. So the Environment Act, as Philip talked about, gives duties to various parties. It gives duties to DEFRA to produce a strategic plan for storm overflows and report about the elimination of discharges. And that's what DEFRA published in late August this year. It's put new duties on water companies to show a progressive reduction in spills from storm overflows. But on the monitoring side, it's specifically put duties on water companies to report their event duration monitoring annually, to provide near real-time spill reporting information. So when an overflow spills, provide that information to stakeholders, customers, members of the public within 1 hour of it happening. And really importantly, within the Environment Act, it's put a duty on water companies to monitor the impact that they have on the environment through continuous water quality monitors upstream and downstream of storm overflows and sewage treatment works, wastewater treatment works. And also to develop these statutory plans, looking not just at the next year, next 5 years, but the next 25-year horizons. Also a duty on the Environment Agency to report EDM data annually. We already do that, we've done that for the last couple of years, so we'll continue doing that. So, almost there in my presentation. Just want to say something on the DEFRA Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan. It's got 4 key targets. One's about protecting the environment, so there's no local adverse ecological impact from storm overflows on our water environment. The second one's about protecting public health around bathing waters. Thirdly, it's about acceptability of storm overflow discharges, and this is where the 10 rainfall events, the 10 spills comes in. And then fourthly, there's something in there about aesthetic impact. In the past, when we've seen an overflow that's been causing gross solids pollution downstream of an overflow, then screens have been put on those overflows, generally 6 mil, but again that's been quite reactive. What the Storm Overflow Reduction Plan does, it gives the green light to put screens on all storm overflows. So, my last slide. So some of the challenges and opportunities which are monitoring specific. I think there's a real need to improve the reliability and consistency of event duration monitoring data. The industry's gone a long way from monitoring something like 15% of storm overflows in 2015 to 85% in 2021 and 100% by end of December 2023. But that reliability, consistency, and quality of that data needs to improve. We need to make the EDM data available in near real time. That's an obligation on the water companies, but obviously the Environment Agency is going to work with the water companies to help them do that. I think that's got challenges. The industry needs to develop a platform to share that with communities, and what will happen is that will increase public stakeholder visibility, and no doubt that will lead to more queries about why is this overflow spilled. The Environment Agency, the water companies need to develop its communications and how it reacts to this new data source, this new real-time data source, and how it informs our regulatory work. Event duration monitoring provides us an opportunity to provide a much clearer line of sight to what we put in the permit, to what we monitor through event duration monitoring, to how we assess compliance, and then, if necessary, take enforcement action. And we're looking at putting spill frequency triggers within permits. So these overflows, which are going to be improved through the storm overflow reduction plan, when we review the permits for those, we're going to put the spill frequencies into the permits to provide that much clearer line of sight. On continuous water quality monitoring, the scale of the ask is huge. The scale of the ask is huge for the supply chain. Not just the manufacturers, but the installers, and also the training need and the capability. It isn't just the capacity; it's the capability of people within the sector, the capability of the sector to get this kit in. Also, within capability, we're in lots of plots, like the one on the right-hand side, showing dissolved oxygen, ammonia, temperature. We need to make sense of that. That's a huge ask. There's going to be a huge amount of data. We need to streamline how we make sense of that. Obviously, that data is going to inform the Environment Agency's enforcement activities. We'll be able to see that an overflow spilt, maybe in dry weather, and we'll be able to see the environmental impact of that. Obviously, this data is going to inform the Environment Agency's wide work on environment planning, river basin management plans, and again, it will increase the number of queries to us, which we'll have to react to. That's all I had to say. And yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to pick up two things from that: communication, education, skills. Absolutely vital. We're going to rely on our professional organisations, and by happenstance, our next speaker is Alastair Chisolm, the Director of Policy from CIWEM.
Thanks, Oliver. So, like the others, I'm not going to talk in any technical detail about monitoring. Indeed, I'm probably not going to talk about monitoring much at all, because I'm a North London townhouse dwelling, podcasting policy wonk. What I want to illustrate to you is that this is not just an issue for the water industry. A lot of what we've talked about at the moment is the really big program of work that is going to be delivered by the water companies. But fundamentally, we're going to need a multidisciplinary, multifaceted approach to tackling storm overflows, because that way we can get the most value for money out of that £56 billion program. And that way, all of the work that water companies are going to do between now and 2050 won't conceivably, over time, beyond that period, gradually be eroded because other things going on in the wider water system, of which we're all part of, will progressively erode the value of what has been delivered in infrastructure terms. So a little while ago, we did an investigation into what that wider system looks like. And we worked with some clever academics at the Centre for Systems Engineering and Innovation at University College London, who took some outputs of some workshopping that we did with a wide range of stakeholders, and drew that system into a map. And I'll run you through some of that process now and what I think it means in terms of the direction we can go in. Not going to go into much of the detail because others have covered it already, but give or take, that's the nature of the picture. And that picture has come about, as Phil said, because of the event duration monitoring network that's been installed since 2010. And it's not a perfect picture, so there is a need for monitoring and enhancement. the additional monitoring that Philip campaigned for, and that extra EDM capacity, and also refinement potentially of some of the installations, because I think there's maybe a question over some of the accuracy of the data that they're kicking out. Either way, there's massive numbers in there, and it's a big challenge. And of course, there's been a big policy response, and thank you very much, Philip, for that. And Phil, you went into the detail of what that means for the different key parties, so I won't dwell on that. In the work that we did, we engaged with a representative range of stakeholders, people who work on this and are concerned with this on a daily basis. We did not hold those workshops in bathing gear in a river. They were behind screens. And we asked a range of questions that helped us map out what that system looked like. Those stakeholders came from everyone from campaign groups through water companies, through regulators, local authorities, and a range of water management professionals. We went through that workshopping process. We gave the outputs to Imperial College, and they mapped it out. But part of this was all about visualizing what that system looks like. So I've got some depictions here of what I think Philip and Phil have talked about. Not everything, although there is a horse in there, Philip. But really, this is the kind of the origins of the combined sewer system. Goes back to the days of Bazalgette and so on. And in those times, it was a very valid approach to managing sewage. They were designed according to the pressures, with some headroom included. But by and large, you know, our towns and cities were smaller. We had less impermeable surfaces in them. We used less water in our households. We produced less foul sewage. We didn't have climate change, so we didn't have these intense rain events that are sometimes the problem. And we weren't using products like plastic containing wet wipes and chucking as much fats, oils and greases down our sewers as perhaps we are doing now. You move on to the present day, all of those pressures have ramped up. And so we are using those bad products much more frequently. There's more of us. We use much more water in the home, kind of getting on for double to the amount that we used in the 1960s. We've got climate change. We've put a lot of urban infill into our urban environments, so we have so much more hard surface. But fundamentally, a lot of the time, that core sewage infrastructure is still the same. And a lot of the time, it's degraded a bit, so it's not performing as well. There's maybe groundwater ingress in there. All of that adds to the frequency that storm overflows spill. We know where we want to get. We know what that vision looks like, and it is a vision which involves small improvements, maybe large improvements on the part of the water industry, to a whole range of different components of that system. So we're more water efficient. We've got a lot more blue-green infrastructure in our urban area. We've repaired the sewage network. We've added some extra storage capacity in. We've added extra capacity into treatment works. And what that should all amount to is that the pressure on the system as a whole is such that it's not resulting in those spills. People and wildlife are happier and healthier, and that's something that we should all want. There's a range of solutions available to deliver this. Everything through from the reed bed systems and SUDS that Philip was talking about, through to active system management within the sewer networks, creation of smart networks and optimization of how they perform, the additional below ground storage and potentially separation. Although on separation, I would like to make the point that it's not a panacea. It doesn't necessarily tackle the issue of contaminated highway runoff particularly well. So we have to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that separation equals absolutely pristine rivers, because there's not that guarantee there. Now, in terms of what that system looks like, as I said, the kind of discussions and the debates that we had in those workshops were all taken and downloaded by Imperial. and they work their systems thinking voodoo as they do. I don't know, it's some kind of dark art, and they mapped it out. And what you can see here is all of the different colored nodes are different subsystems of that bigger water management system. I don't expect you to see the detail of this. There are components, the blue, which is one of the biggest bits, is the water management system and the water industry piece. The green bits are kind of environmental factors. The lavender color is kind of housing and planning. The purple is transport. There's other components that relate to funding. The pink bit is actually societal thinking and behaviors, which I think in that graph that you showed, Phil, is really critical on the path for improvement. There's some bits about innovation, and they all interact in different ways. And the way in which they interact varies. So there are positive feedback loops, there are balancing loops, there are different flows between these nodes. They may be regulatory, they may be informational, or they may be physical. But they all interplay, and they all have an effect ultimately on that little tiny circle in the middle, which is storm overflows. We did a similar exercise with the regulations and mapped those out, because before you even start thinking about the Environment Act, there's a huge amount of either legislation, regulation, policies or plans out there which in theory should have the ability to reduce the impact of storm overflow spills or the frequency of it. And the color coding is very similar. So we've got key nodes there that relate to environmental policy and planning, water policy and planning, housing and the planning system, transport, and flood risk management. And flood risk management, I think, is a particularly key one, because one of the main ways in which water companies want to tackle this is through getting surface water out of the combined sewer networks, and that's a key surface water management objective for flood risk management purposes. So all of these different bits of regulation speak to each other in different ways. Sometimes it's kind of a one-way flow, sometimes it's two ways, sometimes they're conflicting actually. So again, it's a complex web that really can have quite significant impacts on the overall performance of the system in the end. We made a range of recommendations. I'm not going to go into these in detail, I'll just summarize them, but you can see where the different areas of activity really lie within government. It's between largely DEFRA's remit and DLUC's remit. In key areas of water management, obviously flood risk management, highways, and housing policy. So recommendations very quickly. We really want to see an integrated catchment level approach driven by water companies, which delivers a range of different, hopefully multifunctional solutions in order to deliver these kind of outcomes. We really, really want to see commencement of Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act. That's one of the key bits of this whole piece that was worked into the Environment Act that isn't explicitly water company focused. Now, DEFRA has done a review. I think it's still due to publish it. I think it's a positive statement on where we should go with Schedule 3. But I think there's maybe some unknowns about how far or how long it might take to progress down that route, given the way that policy is now pointing from a deregulation point of view. We'd also like to see, or stakeholders really wanted to see, strong regulation by the Environment Agency and Ofwat, and I think we're really seeing that now. Very explicit guidelines coming through from both the environmental and the economic regulator. We would like to see government banning plastics in wet wipes. There is no reason why we should be having products that manufacturers know are commonly flushed down the toilet which contain plastics, when we have a perfectly good fine to flush standard. And if they won't get rid of plastics in their products, then we think they should just be banned. We want to see a little bit more of a look at the incentives that can be put in place to drive behaviours at the kind of property level. Some water companies do have area-based charging, others don't. There is maybe a question, if it works for some, why doesn't it work for all? I guess it's probably unrealistic for that to be implemented at a domestic level, but it probably warrants another look at the commercial scale. Then there's a little cluster around how the flood risk management piece and local authorities, lead local flood authorities and water companies can really work as effectively as possible together. So around things like opportunity mapping, the potential for distributed SUDS schemes. If you haven't seen the London Strategic SUDS pilot study, look it up, have a look. It's a really good illustration of how you can get quite significant benefit through distributed SUDS interventions. And whilst that was primarily focused at managing surface water flood risk, it very much recognised that there would be ancillary benefits for storm overflows discharges. So we'd like to see more of that happening. These small SUDS installations can really be tricky to deliver for local authorities with flood defence grant and aid. The process for them accessing that money, if you're dealing with the small interventions or a small cluster of interventions, can really be prohibitive. So we'd like to see a look at how those rules attached to that could be relaxed a little bit. And also partnership funding is another fundamental barrier there. I think if water companies and their local authorities could work more closely together to support local authorities deliver surface water schemes where there isn't necessarily a majority flood risk issue there, but there's also associated storm overflow mitigation benefit, I think there's a synergy that could be better exploited there. And then a little bit more radical and left field, we feel that there could be a legal duty on highways authorities that when they're doing street works, whether that's traffic calming, whether it's maintenance, whether it's tree planting, that they look to see if there are opportunities to disconnect from any combined sewer networks that they drain to and instead treat that water through SUDS. And also in certain places, there are infrastructure coordination bodies within local authorities. The Greater London Authority have been doing that in certain boroughs, and they've got a bid into Bays, I think, to look to mainstream that much wider. Again, looking back at these small distributed SUDS schemes, there is enormous benefit in being able to be opportunistic, so you can make savings on excavation and infill costs and that kind of thing. And that sequencing of works, which so often doesn't happen, could go a long way to just getting more bang for buck out of this overall 56 billion pot. Now, the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan was published, as Phil said and Philip said. In terms of our take on it, did it reflect the kind of systems thinking that we've been looking at in our work? Well, some headlines, is it ambitious enough? I think from our perspective, yes, it is, but we're quite a wide-ranging organisation. We've got water industry members who feel that it's potentially going to be really quite challenging, and the pace of delivery that it's demanding may drive them into rather more conservative and safe options, the hard concrete ones, than the blue-green infrastructure solutions. On the other side of that coin, some of our stakeholder groups that are more on the campaigning side feel that having to tolerate these kinds of spill levels out to 2050 still feels an enormously long time. So it's almost a situation where we kind of feel it's good, but we know that really in a lot of places, nobody's really perfectly happy with it. It is quite strong on partnership working, and that's really good because within a systems thinking approach, working in partnership is absolutely critical. And I think that's been taken forward in some of the guidance coming through from Ofwat and DEFRA, and has been picked up within the drainage and wastewater management plans, which I'm going to comment on in a second. It's strong on SUDS. It does advocate SUDS, but on the flip side of that, it does call out some doubt around the evidence base around how easily they can be delivered and how they perform. And maybe there's a monitoring requirement there. I think Nick Mills from Southern is doing some work with Exeter looking at SUDS performance to help inform their planning. But maybe there is an area of need to really build up that evidence base around how SUDS can perform in different locations. And then there is that commitment within the plan to publish a review of Schedule 3. And that's fantastic, something we've wanted to see. But again, slight nagging doubts as to whether that might be perceived to be a little bit of too much of a burden on the public purse right at this minute. So quite eagerly awaiting the outcomes of that. So much hangs on drainage and wastewater management plans. I think this is absolutely fundamental. They are the vehicle through which the storm overflow programs will be delivered. From a systems perspective, having looked across a number of the plans, they're really quite good in terms of the sentiment and the spirit that comes through them. There has been some feedback from Ofwat in the last few days that it wants them to be a lot more ambitious, more granular in the evidence that they're putting forward for why they can and can't use blue-green infrastructure, and the detail behind how they will make partnership working actually work in practice. But generally speaking, there's a lot of commitment to co-design, collaboration, systems thinking within these plans, and I've just pulled out some examples there. I think fundamentally this whole piece, that EDM monitoring data, that Philip's work has really kicked off, presents a huge amount of opportunities. Water companies are kind of, if you think of ecosystems, they're the sort of equivalent within the systems. I don't know if you get apex actors within system thinking, but they're the equivalent of an apex predator, I guess, within an ecosystem. They have huge convening power, being these regional bodies that they are. They are able to engage a wide range of stakeholders. Sometimes that's not easy for them, and again, I know from Nick's experience, he's finding it is hard work doing that engagement, but it does reap rewards. They also have huge resource, and we know the numbers about what's going to be invested, and that often dwarfs the resources that are available to an awful lot of the partners, but it can help mobilize and unlock wider sources of funding, which are going to be really important. The AI and tech development that is coming on stream now that people have talked about already, not only can put data in people's hands, not only can enhance the operation of our drainage systems, but it can also really channel opportunities to educate and inform people about the role that they play in this system and where they can make a positive difference. So big opportunity there. Nature-based solutions, I think, is an absolutely massive opportunity. Huge facades retrofit, where we really didn't have a big drive of facades retrofit previously, which is great. And the partnerships emphasis, I think, again, from a systems perspective, is really, really important. And this could be quite transformational from that perspective. Having said that, I think there are some concerns and some threats around this, and it really relates to how quickly some of this new and novel way of working and thinking can actually come on stream. The scale and the cost, I think, is really big. And again, in the current climate, additions to customer bills may become politically a little bit more unpalatable. So maybe some questions there. The deregulatory policy direction at the moment, I think a lot of these measures point towards more of a regulatory approach around housing planning. But what we're hearing is probably pointing in the other direction to that. The effectiveness of partnership working can be challenging, and I think that will be a real steep learning curve for a lot of people involved. And the final thing, and I was going to say it's an elephant in the room, but I think Philip put it out here, really is the trust issue that water companies have at the moment. The Consumer Council for Water, CCW, they do an annual survey of their customer base, and in the spirit of data or evidence-led messaging, they have found that customer trust in water companies has gone down over the past couple of years, particularly the last year. Now, fundamentally, it's incumbent on water companies to find a way to rebuild that trust, because having the public on side and doing what they can to help improve this picture is really important, because there are a number of things that they can do. The beauty, I think, lies in this monitoring and data and how it can be presented, because if companies can demonstrate the progress that they're making, the effectiveness of the solutions that they're putting in place, the ability to tell people when they should and shouldn't bathe and what they can do to help, that can go a really long way to start building trust, add to the transparency of what companies can do, and hopefully help mobilize that whole system. So Thanks very much.
Thank you.